And hello to another episode of the Punk and Copter cast. I am T Corbin 83, and today I am talking with Jaycee, lead everything behind a Duel Hand Disaster tracker, one of the more eye-catchy things from the recent Boston Fig Fest.
Oh, thanks, man.
So we'll start with the standard: who you are, what you do.
Well, I am Jaycee Salinas. I'm the creative director and sole employee of Ask an Enemy Studios out of El Paso, Texas. I'm currently working on a game called Duel Hand Disaster Tracker. It is the only split-screen, single-player, twin-stick risk 'em up in which your score is meaningless unless you exist. That's a mouthful.
Okay, so how did you get introduced to video games, like as a form of recreation?
Oh man, just like anyone would when I was a kid. I just started playing video games at like friends' houses and stuff like that. And then when my dad took my brother and I with him to go make a payment on one of his, I want to say it was like a Montgomery Ward or something, at the mall one day. My brother and I were playing. They had the NES and the Sega Master System, side by side, on these like big screen TVs or whatever, just demoing them, and we were just playing them. And then I just remember my dad coming up to us and just, we were not expecting this in any way whatsoever, and he just said, "Which one do you guys want?" And my brother and I just looked at each other like, "What the hell?" Yeah, and honestly, I think that was just like the start of everything. Uh, there was, I played games like almost anyone would when they're a kid, but there was a pretty long period there when I was maybe about 15, where I got into writing music, though. Like I started, uh, you know, m- um, creating bands and stuff like that. So between that time until about maybe I was like maybe 19 or 20, I didn't play as many video games, but I still had a console. I wasn't into it as much as I was obviously when I was a kid. But I started getting more back into it when I was about 20. So maybe about like the Xbox One or the original Xbox One, PlayStation 2 era. Uh, my cousin basically introduced me to like Devil May Cry and Resident Evil and games like that. And then I discovered like Parasite Eve and going back to like the PS1 times, like just it got me back into games, and I started finding all these other games I got into, and that was just the start of it again.
Okay,
That's a pretty long how I got into it, huh?
yeah. So you mentioned it a bit already, but what was your favorite game and or games growing up?
Oh, straight up, it had to be like Mortal Kombat and stuff, man. Like I was totally obsessed with Mortal Kombat. My brother was into like Street Fighter and stuff. I was more into Mortal Kombat. As a matter of fact, one of my Twitter picture for my personal account is me in seventh grade, with my Mortal Kombat shirt on, and I always say that if you had the ability to flip my head around in that picture, you would see the Roman numeral 2 that my mom shaved into my head. Yeah, it was Mortal Kombat for sure. A bunch of other stuff also, but definitely Mortal Kombat.
Okay, so what made you decide to get into game design?
So that's actually kind of a longer story. I don't know if you want me to spend too much time on that, but the basic idea is, um, I was in bands like I mentioned for a while, and I kind of just got to a point where I got sick and tired of just bands kind of breaking up and stuff like that. Um, and kind of the last uh, the last band I was in, uh, it was just things like that, like just band members were too flaky, yada yada yada. Um, and I just kind of needed another creative outlet, but something that I could possibly do on my own and not have to worry about, bringing on a whole other team of people whose schedule you have to manage and decide if it's even something they want to do. And for whatever reason, I don't know, I guess I just saw Indie Game the movie and I was like, maybe I could make just a really simple video game, like just to see if I could pull it off, you know? And yeah, it was around that time when like games like that, like Super Meat Boy, like more indie type games were actually being made by like smaller groups of people, like smaller teams or whatever. So yeah, just a spark got lit, man. But it was weird because obviously I had no programming experience whatsoever. I didn't know how to program. I didn't know how to draw, really. The only thing I could do is write music. But I started to, you know, like I was following a bunch of like podcasts and stuff like that, like OneUp.com and all that kind of stuff, where they would interview a lot of like indie developers and they would just talk about like the things they would talk about when they were working on a game was exactly how I felt when I was writing music with bands and stuff. It was just this idea of just creating something from nothing and having people kind of react to it. You know, like creating something that you think people will have fun doing. It's kind of like when you're writing music, like you want to write music that when you perform, people enjoy watching you perform, or even just listening to it, you know? So that's basically what got me into wanting to make a video game. I just didn't know how. So I could get into that if you want me to.
By all means,
Yeah, totally. So
ahead.
basically, you know, you think when you're wanting to learn how to make a video game, well, you're probably your first instinct is to think, okay, well, I could go to school, right? You go to college or whatever to learn how to program, learn how to design, whatever. So that was my thing is I was like, all right, well, I'll just go to school. I think that's a good way to do it. And you always see all these ads in like magazines for like Full Sail University, DigiPen, and all that kind of stuff. So that was probably the worst mistake I ever made. I basically gave it a year. I wasn't learning one goddamn thing about how to make a video game. So I figured instead of going into debt, not learning how to make a game, I'd rather go into debt trying to learn how to make a game. So I basically just started going to events like GDC and stuff like that, and just picked up Unity and taught myself how to make the game by watching their tutorials. So like Unity has a really good tutorial section on their website.
Mm-hmm.
And basically what I did was I started watching those, and then well, actually, let me go back a little bit. I started the game in GameMaker because again, I wanted to make something small, something I could finish, something I knew that I, as one person, could make. So I started the game in GameMaker, and you know, started messing around with what the idea was, and then basically from there. I went to my first E3 in 2013, almost immediately after dropping out of college or whatever. And at that, if you remember correctly, like that year was the year that Sony was pushing like their indie initiatives. So they had all these like, you know, Galaxy and all these games that were Transistor that were coming out on like PS4 as like their big indie push or whatever, right? It's like I think the first year that Sony put indie games on the E3 stage, which was super rad. And yeah, I just went to the Figueroa because I was like, well, I know that's where most of these like journalist people that I'd followed on podcasts would hang out. And let alone like that night, I met who would soon become my Sony account manager, was Nick Sutner. And are you familiar with Nick Sutner at all?
I've heard the name before.
Okay. Yeah, he used to write for EGM and stuff like that, and then he obviously left and then started working at Sony, and then he went to Oculus, and now he's doing his own thing or whatever. But yeah, like I just saw him across from the pool, and I was there with a buddy of mine who quite possibly was the catalyst that got me to get up and talk to Nick. And had I not talked to Nick that day, who knows what would have happened, man? Because it was because I met Nick that I got my PlayStation Vita dev kit. And then when I got my Vita dev kit, they did not support GameMaker at the time. So that's when I had to make a decision whether I was going to do Unity, Unreal, or their proprietary Fire engine. And basically just went with Unity because, again, it was just a lot easier to find answers to questions that I had with Unity, because it was a lot easier to Google something. Unreal was still kind of closed off, and Fire Engine was also all proprietary. So I knew it was just going to be a bunch of like straight up computer programming nerds who like were going to look at me and be like, what are you even doing, man? Where like at least, learning Unity was like you could still hide behind your Google search bar. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But yeah, I basically just taught myself there, and then I went to my first GDC in 2014 because I wanted to get into basically like meeting other people that were making games and that were in my situation of like just starting out. Because again, like I think a lot of people got into making games because of like Indie Game the Movie and just that whole push of like indie games. So yeah, I don't know. I think it was just perfect timing on my end. It was the right time and the right place to get started. And there were just so many people to learn from. So I just kind of started that way.
All right. So
let me know if I'm rambling too, man, because I mean, I can talk about this stuff forever, but yeah.
So you can get into the main portion of this. So, if we were Boston Fig Fest or any sort of convention and someone was walking by your booth, how would you like? And they asked you, "What is a Duel Hand Disaster?"
Oh yeah, no, for sure,
tracker,
man.
Like, how would you give them the rundown?
Sure. So the first thing I always try to get people with is that I let them know it's like you're playing Galaga on the left-hand side and Pac-Man on the right side, and it's like you're playing both of those at the same time. So basically, a Duel Hand Disaster Tracker is, again, a split-screen, single-player, twin-stick risk 'em up. The reason I call it a risk 'em up is, unlike most shooters or shoot 'em ups, you only keep your score when you decide to call it, basically. So you cannot play till death. If you die, not only do you wipe your score, there's a possibility that you might even wipe your leaderboard position. So yeah, like at its base level, it's a score-based, score-chasing type game.
Mm-hmm.
The devil's in the details, though. So it's just about killing enemies on the left to earn points while recovering resources on the right that helps you multiply those points. So kind of like just at face value, some people get kind of intimidated by it. But that's why I always try to tell people it's like, just give it a shot. You'll instantly know whether it's something you want to do or not. And for the most part, it tends to lean towards they want to,
Mm-hmm.
which is good. It's a good problem to have.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's basically it. There's obviously little details and mechanics and stuff, but you kind of have to watch the video, and there's plenty of it on my YouTube page, youtube.com/AskAnEnemyStudios, so you can get an idea of how the game works. But yeah, it's a left stick, right stick kind of thing. So left stick controls the left side, right stick controls the right side. The most important thing I try to let people know is the left side does not take damage.
Mm-hmm.
The right side does. The right side is the only side that can die. And if she dies, it's game over. You wipe out. So again, the devil's in the details in the sense that the left side doesn't take damage. However, it can also only move left and right. So it was a fine balance of trying to simplify a lot of the movement and weapons and stuff like that, so that I've played quite a couple games actually where you control two things at once. And one of the main reasons why I made this game the way it is because a lot of those games would share the screen. So you're both playing on the same screen. You got two characters going on the left and the right hand side. But then when they cross the center of the screen, you lose focus on who you're controlling.
Mm-hmm.
So that, for example, in Brothers, when you're trying to solve a puzzle, that can get frustrating because like, the top brother or the brother on the right stick possibly moves to the top left corner, and then the left brother moves to like the bottom middle right corner, and you're trying to pull a log and like fight off like a wolf with the other brother, and it gets kind of frustrating at times, especially when stuff like that gets like it's timing based or whatever, right? It just kind of feels unfair. So I kind of took a lot of those mechanics to heart when I was designing this game, and it was also by watching people play and what they were understanding, what they weren't throughout the years I've been showing the game. I started to do things like, for example, the right side is the only side that takes damage, but now when you get to like a resource and you stop on it, that's how you recover it. You need to stay on it. You don't take damage anymore so that you can look over to the left and make sure you're shooting something. Otherwise, you're just wasting your link. And your link is what is basically like fuel on the left-hand side. So whenever you shoot and move on the left, you're consuming your link. And you'll basically need to get resources from the right side to bring that link back, basically.
Yeah.
You got to play it, right, Tyler? I mean,
yeah, briefly. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so those are the basic mechanics. Playing the game is how you'll understand like all the other little details like multipliers, how to what your upgrades to your weapons do, and all that kind of stuff. But it's as simple of a game as you can think of, but not in a bad way, right? Like, I mean, it's a simple game by just looking at it, but I try to keep things interesting by making mechanics that are as badass as I can make them.
Okay, so like when this game was still in like the theoretical stages, did you always have the idea of making it, as you said, single player, dual screen, risk 'em up, or did you decide to like combine the shooty aspects and the traveling around gathering resources aspects together?
Oh yeah, no man, from the beginning it was a split screen single player. So I wanted to give the player something to do that just felt like, for example, when you play Brothers, controlling two things at once scratches a part of your brain that you never knew needed scratching, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I just kind of wanted to do that. So from the beginning, like there's a trailer on my YouTube page that shows, it's called TLDR Progress. And it shows what the game looked like in Game Maker when I first started it. And that's like version 0.2. And it shows you exactly what the game was. It was basically a split screen from the beginning. Obviously, it wasn't nearly as complex because when I started working on it in Game Maker, like I said, I was just going to make it kind of like a never-ending difficulty type game where I was just going to do that and then spit it out and see if it is something I could do. You know what I mean? Like see if it's something I could accomplish and finish or whatever. But when I moved into Unity, that's when I started to get more into changing camera angles and all that kind of stuff. And just because of Unity itself is when the game started to get a little more complex because I was able to do more complex things. But yeah, like the basic idea of split screen single player was there from the beginning. So every time people kind of come up to like the booth or whatever and they see it split screen, they're wondering who the second player is because there's only ever really one person playing at a time. And it's pretty cool when their mind just melts that you're controlling the two things at once. Yeah, it's a super rad feeling. Even more so when they play it and they like stick with it too. It's just super awesome. Especially to see people not give up, you know, because obviously you're going to get those people that are immediately turned off by it. They're just like, I can't do this. I can't do this. But it's the ones that actually try that immediately either know they don't want to play this or they stick with it. And again, more than not, it's always the case that they do stick with it, which is pretty rad. I mean, yeah, don't get me wrong. You know, there are people who are kind of like, I don't want to control two things at once, and that's fine. But it is definitely few and far between.
Okay, so like you previously stated, the left portion of the screen is kind of sort of shoot 'em up, top down shooter like Galaga, and the other is you were traveling around a
Right.
space with a lot more maneuverability, collecting resources. So similar to the previous question, I was making each half of the game controlled like completely differently. Was that something you wanted to make sure was there from the get-go, or in earlier versions did the two halves sort of play similarly?
So not in the sense of kind of connecting as explicitly as they do now. Originally it was really meant more of a way to get you to do the two things at one time. But again, that was more of a once I got into Unity, that's when the complexity came in of I had it the game looked like how would I say this? For lack of a better word, it looked beefier, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I couldn't just make it like, okay, you're controlling this ship and just killing things, and then on this side you're avoiding things. Because again, the Game Maker version was basically on the left side, you just it really was like Galaga. You were just kind of shooting things and getting points for that. And on the right side, all you were really doing was avoiding asteroids. So kind of asteroids were just like bouncing around on the right side. And the further and further that you played, the more asteroids would come in on the right side. And that was basically it. Again, because that kind of was what I wanted to do, is just really simple, just score based. You get in, you get out. But as I started to get more complex, camera angles and just stuff like that, it just naturally kind of progressed into uh, doing something a little more interesting, but also the way Brothers was, where doing something, one brother was doing something that meant something to the other brother. So like again, you're warding off, you're defending like an area from wolves that was trying to keep the other brother, allowing the other brother to spin the pipe or whatever that was making the water flow through or whatever. So it was that idea of connecting both brothers. With me, it was more like, well, how can I make this side do something that this side needs to rely on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, because also you got the type of people that, and I still get that nowadays, where they're like, well, why can't you just have one player be on two on the I mean, two players grab one controller each side, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it was kind of also a way to balance that. So if someone would get on the other side, you still had to call it out to the other person. You couldn't just do independently two things. Otherwise, yeah, kind of what's the point of that? Um, yeah. Also, one of the other things was when I started designing the game, and like when I got an Xbox One dev kit and I had a Kinect, I started to think about ideas where, with the Kinect, you can actually detect how many people are in the room, and if there's two people, kind of connecting to one controller, you can do stuff to mess with them that way. That's kind of stuff I want to do with like the Switch version, also where you can take the Joy Cons off, hand one off to another friend, but as a developer, you can detect whether the Joy Cons are off axis of where they were, or you know what I mean? Because if they're docked on a Switch, they're going to be very, very similar. But if you take them off, it's going to be really hard to keep them exactly the same, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But at the same time, then you're also penalizing the player who does just take off the Joy Cons and play, like a lazy buffoon on the sofa. So yeah, it's kind of like, do you want to put the extra work in to do that? And if so, is it gonna be worth it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and since it's just me, like adding that much work, I'm not 100% sure would be worth it. Um, so I'm still debating that, because that is kind of something I can still add in at the last minute. But anyway, yeah, it's just the idea of trying to make both sides connect to each other. Uh, and I try to do that as much as possible.
Okay, so one of the something you mentioned earlier during the interview, and something that was very apparent during
Hmm?
Boston Fig Fest, is that you said that the score doesn't matter unless you exist.
Right.
Now, what exactly does that mean?
Oh yeah, so that is the whole purpose of the game. So I just try to be a little more artsy about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, your score is meaningless unless you exist, means that um, you only keep your score if you're alive, and you have to decide when to keep it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so basically, on the right hand side, you're recovering material and parts. Material is used to multiply your score, and it's used to keep the left side from blocking out. Parts are what you use to extract with your score, which means keep your score. The secondary thing of parts is that it also unlocks defenses on the right side. So you have 4 defenses on the right, 4 weapons on the left. So think about the left side's assault, the right side's defense. But yeah, so basically what you do is you capture 12 parts. Once you have all 12 of those parts, the center of the screen says extract ready or extract when ready. And from that point forward, now it's just up to you whether you want to stay, you want to keep what you have, mark it on the leaderboard, or if you want to push your luck and make it a risk 'em up and try to get a higher score, right? So yeah, from there, and now it's just activating shields with activate a multiplier on the left. Keeping the multiplier active on the left is what keeps the shields active on the right. Boosting when your shields are active doesn't cause damage. So again, the devil's in the details. It's all about just playing the game to like figure out all these little things. And it sounds like a lot, but again, it's just taking your time with it, figuring out all the little details, and then just using that to your advantage. It kind of is like that whole thing of like when life gives you lemons, what do? You know what I mean? You kick ass, make bombs, and blow up everything.
Okay.
Yeah, totally.
So, when the game is, fully released and sent out into the world, what platforms do you intend to make it available on?
So it is currently on Steam Early Access. I'm aiming to hopefully be out by January on PS4, Xbox One, and Switch, and obviously out of Early Access. The game's running right now on. I was actually just testing it on the Xbox One right now. It's running great on consoles, but Switch tends to have a little bit of a performance issue. And it's all my fault because obviously, like I said, I'm not a programmer, so optimization is something I definitely need to look into. But the frame rate tends to drop on the Switch when chaos happens, which means there's a lot of enemies and fireballs on the screen and stuff like that. I've gotten it to be a lot better recently, which is awesome, but it still needs some work for sure. But those are all the platforms that I'm hoping to release on at the same time. Also, leaderboards need to work across, not cross-platform, but individually across the platforms, if that makes sense. Okay. Whenever I say that, yeah, people tend to think, oh, there's one leaderboard for every console. I'm like, no, leaderboards individually on each console. I need to get those to work. Luckily, I made a friend at GDC, I think it was last year or the year before, who basically helped me with that and rewrote my whole leaderboard code. And now I'm just wrapping my head around how he did that so I can start connecting everything else. And, hopefully he's there to stick around to the end. He's been an awesome friend since then. So it's been rad. Okay. But those are the final things I need to get done, man. For the most part, the game is pretty much done. I've been experimenting with some VR, with a VR mode, but that's really just because I've been wanting to throw that in. But I really, really doubt I'll be able to throw that in by launch. So it might be because I want it to also matter like the game itself kind of does. And right now it's more of an idea that I just kind of had brewing in the back that I kind of just wanted to start also testing the waters of VR and see how input works and all that kind of stuff. And it's functional. There's a VR mode in there now that's functional, but it's not publicly available because it's not something I want people to break just yet.
Okay, and now it's time for the question that anyone who's been on this show always understands perfectly, and there's never any confusion ever. So, in your opinion, is video games?
I was wondering if that actually was a question or if you forgot a part of it. Yeah. Yeah, is video games what? I'm not gonna lie, I didn't understand that question at all. What's the story behind that, man?
A few months back when I started preparing questions in advance just to make the whole thing a slightly smoother process, I'm just like, why not? And the answers, I get a surprising variety of answers. Some people just take it at face value and answer with a literal yes.
Yeah.
People go on to mini tangents about the merits of video games as a medium. And
Right.
I guess it depends on a person's particular video game background.
Oh yeah, no, totally. Absolutely, man.
Yeah. So, what's your answer?
I would say is video games no. Just to change the status quo, I guess.
All right then.
Yeah.
So, I know you're probably diverting most of your energies to getting a dual hand disaster tracker
Mhm.
ready to go in your intended release date, but just to speculate, like, are there any other genres that you would be interested in exploring, in the future once this game is, out in the world?
Not. I mean, I definitely have another idea already, kind of sketched out, in my sketchbook of ideas, but it's not. I don't think about it in terms of genre. Like, I don't think, oh, I want to make an RPG next, or I want to make a first-person shooter next, right? I think more in terms of themes, um, and just well, themes that are like fun, like just something like what can I get the player to do, um, and then how could that interaction be interesting? And whatever that becomes, whether it's some kind of visual novel with uh, a Borderlands aesthetic and like Pac-Man creatures or something. I don't know. I don't think about it that way. I just kind of go. Like I'll literally the way this game came to be was me sitting in front of a blank screen, picking up a controller and just fiddling with buttons and thinking like, what would I want to see on the screen? What would I want to do with this controller?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't think about it in terms of genre in any way whatsoever. Um, I just want to make something cool.
All right then.
Yeah. I might think about it after the fact, you know what I mean? Like in terms of because you have to market it and stuff like that, and it's not like I had split screen single player twin stick risk 'em up from the beginning. Um, it just kind of came to me one day, and showing it at events and describing it to people. You kind of tend to you might start off with a really complex description for the game, but you'll end up taking parts out and like cleaning up the whole message over time. Uh, and that's kind of just what happened with this game. So it just became like, I mean, I guess you could just call it a shooter, but obviously I wanted to make it a little more interesting. And I just called it a risk 'em up. And yeah, believe it or not, you get a lot of people saying, "What's a risk 'em up?" Which is cool because that's what I want. As I want people to ask questions anyway. So the whole game is ask questions. The video game.
It's
Try to get people out of their comfort zones.
so the last one on the docket. Just why do you think video games are important?
Um, I don't know. I don't know if I would say they're important. I would just say they're video games. Like they're just something that someone creates to either entertain someone, to tell a story to someone. Uh, yeah, I don't know. I've always thought it's kind of like is art is video are video games art kind of question. I don't I don't know if I have a good answer response to that one, man. I just like video games because they're fun. I don't like the ones that take themselves a little too seriously, but that's just me. Uh, like for example, I really love Metal Gear for the story it tells and stuff, and some people would probably be like, "What story?" And it's just little things that people get from a story someone says, I guess. So like it's not even that Metal Gear has the best story of all time or whatever, but it just little things that trigger you when you're watching a movie or a story or something like that. Uh it's not like I think Metal Gear is telling an important story about nuclear war or anything, even though Kojima might say it probably is. I just like that, but there's also a certain time for that kind of stuff where sometimes what I've gotten into lately is just like wanting to pick up a game and play it, like do something cool. And as much as I love Metal Gear, like trying to jump into a Metal Gear game just takes forever because there's cutscenes that last forever, and you start to realize that there's not much game there really, which is kind of sad. But yeah, I don't know. So in terms of games are important. I don't know if I would even know how to answer that.
So yeah,
I'm sorry if that was a terrible answer, but
that's fine.
it's kind of like Boston Fig was kind of like that. Like it made me really think about that because they take their games like seriously, man. Like their award show was just like this this game got selected for this because it was going to change the world, and I'm like, okay, yeah. Like I don't know. I just don't get that point of view. I mean, you could say that about movies or anything, I guess, really, but yeah, I mean, I don't know. Video games are fun, man, and they should be. At least that's what I want to play, a fun video game, not a game that is trying to change the world, because I don't know if that's possible. People need to change the world, not video games.
All right. And that brings us to the conclusion of this particular episode of the Pumpkin Copter Cast. I would like to thank Jaycee for joining me today.
Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you for doing this, man. Taking the time to do this. I appreciate it.
And there'll be a link to the Ask an Enemy Studios website in the description in case any of the -7 people who watch this are interested.
Yeah, I mean, I'll retweet it and post it on my Discord and my website also, man. I appreciate this stuff. Like having people take the time to interview developers and stuff is super rad. Just because I like talking to people and it keeps your brain juices flowing.
Yep. And if you enjoyed this, be sure to like and subscribe. On the rare occasion I post anything worth paying attention to, you could follow me on the Twitters at tgourmet83. I believe like your Twitters for keeping an eye on a Duel Hand Disaster tracker is also at Ask an Enemy Studios.
It's actually just at Ask an Enemy. Studios didn't fit. I would have to remove the S, and I didn't want to do that.
And yeah, this has been the Pumpkin Copter Cast, a good old podcast about video games, and we hope to see you again.
Peace.